the year 48 BCE. Egypt, the edge of the world, a land of ancient gods and young, treacherous kings. A wretched, tarred fishing boat, reeking of fish and desperation, slowly approached the muddy shore near Pelusium, the eastern outpost of the Ptolemaic kingdom. In it sat a man who, until recently, had been the master of the world. He silently gazed at the inhospitable shore, upon which the figures of several soldiers were visible. He saw no honor guard, no delegation of courtiers in snow-white robes, only indifference and a barely concealed threat. This man was Gnaeus Pompeius, nicknamed Magnus, meaning the Great, a man to whom Rome had thrice granted a triumph, the highest honor available to a mortal, a man who had cleansed the Mediterranean Sea of the pirate plague, conquered the East from Armenia to Judea, and brought immeasurable treasures into the Republic's treasury. A man whose name made kings tremble, and whose portraits depicting him with his hair swept back in the style of Alexander the Great adorned homes throughout the Mediterranean. Just a few weeks ago, he had commanded a vast army twice the size of his enemy's forces. Behind him stood the law, the Senate, all the nobility, and, as it seemed to him, the very might of the Roman Republic. But on the dusty fields of Pharsalus in Greece, military fortune, which had accompanied him his entire life, betrayed him. One genius proved stronger than legions. And that genius was Gaius Julius Caesar. Now, Pompey was a fugitive. His army was shattered, his supporters scattered, his hopes trampled in the dirt. Egypt, ruled by the children of King Ptolemy Auletes, who owed his throne to him, was his last hope. He sought not just refuge here, he sought a foothold to gather new forces and continue the fight for the world he knew. The boat nudged the shore. A hand was offered to him. He recognized one of the greeters, namely Lucius Septimius, a Roman who had once served under him with the rank of military tribune. A familiar face among strangers, perhaps a glimmer of hope. Pompey took a step onto the sand, and in that same instant steel flashed behind him. A sword plunged under his ribs. He did not cry out, he did not beg for mercy. The great Pompey, conqueror of the East, only silently pulled his toga over his head as Roman custom demanded, so that no one would see the expression on his face at the moment of death, to meet the end with dignity. He fell onto the sand, and the assassins fell upon him, severing his head. His decapitated body was left on the shore, to be desecrated by the waves and the wind, until his freedmen gathered splinters from a broken fishing boat to build a funeral pyre for his master. How could a man who had reached such dizzying heights fall so low? How could the one called the Alexander the Great in a toga end his life on a desolate Egyptian beach, murdered by mercenaries on the orders of the court eunuchs of a 13-year-old king? To understand this tragedy, we must return to the very beginning, to the seething cauldron of the late Roman Republic, to an era when the old laws were dying and new ones had not yet been born. An era of titans, tearing apart the greatest power of the ancient world. This is not just the story of a man, it is the story of a dizzying rise and a crushing fall. This is the story of Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus. To comprehend the essence of Pompey, his ambitions, his triumphs, and his final defeat, one must first understand the world that produced him. Rome at the end of the 2nd and beginning of the 1st century before Christ was a colossus with feet of clay. It was no longer the modest peasant republic that had conquered Italy, united by a common threat and common values. It was a giant Mediterranean power, stretching from Spain to Asia Minor, from Gaul to Africa. But its political system, created to govern a single city-state, was hopelessly outdated and creaking at the seams under the weight of its own conquests. For centuries, the cornerstone of the Republic had been the balance of power between the Senate, the aristocratic elite, and the popular assemblies or comitia. But now this balance was destroyed. The immense wealth that flooded into Rome from conquered provinces in the form of taxes, indemnities, and slaves was concentrated in the hands of a few hundred senatorial families. They bought up land throughout Italy, creating gigantic latifundia, that is, estates the size of small towns, which were worked by thousands of slaves. Small farmers, the historical backbone of the Roman army and society, were being ruined. They could not compete with cheap slave labor and the flood of grain from the provinces. Having sold their plots, they flocked to Rome, swelling the ranks of the impoverished, unemployed, and embittered urban proletariat. Rome itself became a seething cauldron. It was a city of contrasts where marble villas of aristocrats stood next to multi-story dilapidated insula, where the poor were crammed together in squalor and unsanitary conditions. The narrow, dirty streets were constantly crowded with people. The constant crush, noise, and threat of fires and collapses made life unbearable and dangerous. This huge, anonymous mass of people torn from their roots became the ideal tool for political manipulation. This proletariat had nothing but its vote in elections, and was ready to sell it to anyone who promised bread and circuses. On this ground, a new type of politician emerged, the so-called populares, or populists. They appealed directly to the crowd, bypassing the Senate, and passed laws through the popular assemblies for land distribution and cheap grain. Their opponents were the Optimates, meaning the best men, the conservative senatorial aristocracy who desperately clung to their privileges and the old order. The political struggle turned into a real war. The attempts of the brothers Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus in 133 and 123 before Christ to carry out agrarian reforms ended in their brutal murder. The streets of Rome, which for centuries had not seen civil strife, were for the first time washed with the blood of citizens. A sacred line had been crossed. But the most terrible blow to the Republic was dealt by a man who, it seemed, should have saved it. Gaius Marius, a brilliant general, a man from an obscure family 7 times consul. At the end of the 2nd century, he saved Rome from the invasion of the Germanic tribes of the Cimbri and Teutones. To do this, he carried out a military reform that had far-reaching fatal consequences. Previously, the army was a citizen militia, to which only property-owning citizens who could afford their own equipment were called up. Marius, facing a shortage of soldiers, began to recruit landless proletarians into the legions. The state now provided them with arms and pay. But most importantly, the general promised them a share of the booty and a plot of land upon completion of service. This created a professional but extremely dangerous army. The soldiers were now loyal not to the abstract republic or the faceless Senate, but to their general, who was the sole guarantor of their future. The army had become a political tool. Whoever had legions had real power. The confrontation between Marius, the leader of the populares, and his young, ambitious rival from the ancient aristocratic gens of the Cornelii, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, leader of the Optimates, escalated into the first full-scale civil war in Rome's history. In 88 before Christ, Sulla did the unheard of, having received command in the war against King Mithridates. But then, being stripped of it through Marius's intrigues, he led his army against Rome itself, violating the sacred law that forbade a general from bringing troops into the city. This was a Rubicon crossed long before Caesar. Then followed years of bloody terror. Marius and his supporters, having seized Rome in Sulla's absence, massacred the Optimates. Then Sulla, returning victorious from the east in 82, responded with an even more terrible terror. He introduced proscriptions, that is, lists of his enemies declared outlaws. This changed the very fabric of Roman society. Now, political dissent was punished by death without trial. Neighbor informed on neighbor, slave on master. The heads of the slain were displayed in the forum, instilling terror in the hearts of citizens. The young generation, to which Pompey belonged, grew up in an atmosphere where loyalty was valued above the law, and violence was the most effective political argument. They saw how in one day one could lose everything, and in another become fabulously rich on someone else's misfortune. It was an age of cynicism and limitless opportunities for those who were bold and cruel enough. Anyone could kill a person on the list and receive a reward for it, and his property would be confiscated. Rome drowned in blood. Thousands were killed. Their fortunes passed into the hands of Sulla's supporters, among whom was the young Marcus Licinius Crassus, who made his fortune on this. It was into this terrible, turbulent era in the year 106 before Christ that Gnaeus Pompeius was born. He belonged to the so-called new nobility. His family came from Picenum, a rural area on the Adriatic coast of Italy. His father, Gnaeus Pompeius Strabo, was a typical product of his age. He was a very wealthy landowner, a talented but extremely greedy, cunning, and unprincipled politician in general. During the so-called Social War, which lasted from 91 to 88 before Christ, when Rome's Italian allies rebelled demanding civil rights, Strabo commanded a Roman army and proved to be a capable but cruel commander. He amassed a huge fortune and achieved the highest office, namely the consulship in 89. But in Rome he was despised for his provincial origins, greed, and duplicity. He maneuvered between Marius and Sulla, trying to profit from their struggle, and was ultimately hated by both sides. Young Pompey grew up in the shadow of his powerful but unpopular father. He spent his youth not in the schools of rhetoric in Rome, but in a military camp. It was a harsh school. From childhood he was accustomed to discipline, the sight of blood, and the hardships of campaign life. He saw how his father commanded legions, how he conducted negotiations, how he wove intrigues. He saw both the boundless devotion of the Pisantine soldiers to their commander and the hatred of the Roman nobility for the upstart. In 87 before Christ, when the Marians besieged Rome, Pompeius Strabo stood with his army at the city gates, waiting and bargaining with both sides. An epidemic broke out in his camp, from which Strabo himself died. His death was greeted with jubilation in Rome. The crowd seized his body and dragged it through the streets. Young Pompey, who was only 21, was left alone. He inherited his father's huge fortune and, more importantly, his vast network of clients and veterans in Picenum, who were loyal to the Pompeian family. He was young, handsome. Plutarch writes that he was compared to Alexander the Great, incredibly rich, and had a potential private army at his disposal. In a world where old laws no longer meant anything, this was the most important capital, and he had no intention of missing his chance. And while Sulla, having defeated Rome's last great enemy in the east, the Pontic king Mithridates VI, was preparing to return to Italy to settle scores with his Marian enemies, chaos reigned in Rome itself. After Marius's death in 86, his associates, Cinna and Carbo, seized power. They ruled as tyrants, disregarding the Senate. All of Italy held its breath, awaiting the inevitable civil war. In this situation, most young aristocrats either fled to Sulla in the east or lay low, waiting to see which side would prevail. But 23-year-old Gnaeus Pompeius did otherwise. He did something that immediately set him apart from the crowd and showed his incredible ambition and organizational talent. He did not wait for Sulla. He decided to bring an army to his future patron himself. Relying on his father's enormous influence in his native Picenum, he announced a levy of legions. This was unheard of. A private individual holding no official position was creating his own army. It was a direct challenge to the existing government, an act of rebellion. His father's veterans, his clients and tenants flocked to his banners. In a short time, this young man assembled a 3,000-strong army, that is, 3 full legions, fully equipped at his own expense. The Marians sent several armies against him, but Pompey, displaying extraordinary command talent, defeated them one after another. He acted boldly and decisively. In one battle, he personally charged, rallying his faltering soldiers. After these victories, he triumphantly joined Sulla's army, which had just landed in Brundisium. Sulla, an old battle-hardened veteran, was amazed. Before him stood a youth who, without any orders, on his own initiative, had brought him a whole army. He rose to greet him, and when Pompey dismounted, Sulla, seeing the respect his soldiers showed him, took off his hat and hailed him with the title Imperator, the honorary title with which legions rewarded their victorious general. From that moment, Pompey became Sulla's right hand, his most effective and most brutal instrument. After Sulla's victory in the decisive battle at the Colline Gate outside Rome and the capture of the city, the era of proscriptions and terror began. And Pompey took a most active part in it. He ruthlessly pursued and executed Sulla's enemies. It was for this cruelty that he earned his first nickname, which in Latin sounded like Adolescentialis Carnifex, which translates as the teenage butcher. Sulla entrusted him with the most responsible and the dirtiest tasks. His first mission was to clear Sicily of the remnants of the Marian army, commanded by Gnaeus Pompeius Carbo, a former consul. Pompey landed in Sicily and quickly suppressed the resistance. Carbo was captured. Pompey held a public trial over him where, as Plutarch writes, he himself acted as both judge and prosecutor, and then ordered him to be taken aside and executed. This act caused murmuring even among Sulla's supporters. The execution of a former consul, the highest magistrate of the Republic, without a trial was a violation of all traditions. But Pompey was implacable. From Sicily, Sulla sent him to Africa, where the last Marian forces had gathered under the command of Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, Cinna's son-in-law. Pompey landed in Africa, defeated Domitius's army in one decisive battle, and, pursuing the enemy, captured and burned their camp. In 40 days, he cleared the entire province. His soldiers, delighted with his swift and decisive victories, again proclaimed him Imperator. Returning to Rome, Pompey demanded from Sulla, who by then had become dictator for life, something unheard of, a triumph. A triumph was the highest military honor in Rome. It could only be awarded to a magistrate, that is, a consul or praetor, who had won a victory over a foreign enemy. Pompey was neither a magistrate nor even a senator. He was a simple equestrian, a private citizen. His victories were won not over a foreign enemy, but in a civil war against Roman citizens. Sulla at first refused, but Pompey brazenly replied that the dictator should remember that more people worship the rising sun than the setting one. This was a barely veiled threat. Sulla, astonished by his audacity and seeing the devotion of his legions to him, was forced to yield. He exclaimed, "Let him triumph!" In 81 before Christ, the 25-year-old Gnaeus Pompeius, a private citizen, celebrated his first triumph. He wanted to enter Rome in a chariot drawn by elephants brought from Africa as a symbol of his victories, but the elephants could not fit through the narrow city gates. They had to be quickly replaced with horses. This triumph was a violation of all laws and traditions. It showed that for Pompey there were no rules. He was the first in Roman history to achieve the highest honor without holding any state office. He was a product of the Civil War, a man who had made a dizzying career on the ruins of the Republic. It was at this time that Sulla, either in jest or seriously, first called him Magnus, meaning the Great, in honor of Alexander the Great, Pompey's idol. This nickname stuck with him forever. But behind the brilliance of this nickname and the triumphal chariot lay the dark reputation of the teenage butcher. He was a hero to his soldiers and Sulla's supporters, but for many in Rome he remained a cruel murderer and an upstart whose rise was an insult to all republican principles. It seemed that with the establishment of Sulla's dictatorship, peace had come to the Republic. but it was the peace of a graveyard. While terror raged in Italy, a pocket of resistance continued to burn in Rome's farthest province, Spain, and it was led by one of the most outstanding and most underrated figures of that era, Quintus Sertorius. Sertorius was not just another Marian commander. He was a man of outstanding abilities, a brilliant guerrilla leader, and a far-sighted politician. Having been appointed governor of Nearer Spain before Sulla came to power, he refused to recognize the dictatorship and created a kind of Rome in exile in Spain. He formed his own senate from Roman aristocrats who had fled to him. He was extremely popular among the local Iberian tribune. He did not just use them as cannon fodder. He treated them with respect, taught them Roman tactics, but at the same time accepted their advice on mountain warfare. The pinnacle of his policy was the founding of a school in the city of Osca, where the children of Iberian chieftains studied Latin and Greek and wore the Roman toga. This was a brilliant move. He not only Romanized the local elite, but also effectively held the noble children as honored hostages, ensuring the loyalty of their fathers. For them, he was not just a Roman governor, but their own chieftain. In military matters, he was an unsurpassed master of small-scale warfare. He avoided large battles where the advantage lay with heavy Roman legions, and wore down the enemy with sudden raids, ambushes, and attacks on communications. He was as elusive as a ghost. His tame white fawn, which he claimed conveyed the will of the gods to him, became a symbol of his invincibility. Against this elusive enemy, Sulla sent one of his best commanders, Quintus Caecilius Metellus Pius. But Metellus, an experienced but slow and straightforward general, could do nothing against Sertorius's guerrilla tactics. The war reached a stalemate. Spain became a running sore on the body of the Republic. In 79 before Christ, Sulla, to everyone's amazement, voluntarily laid down his dictatorial powers and retired to private life. A year later, he died. His death immediately led to a new outbreak of power struggles. One of the consuls, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, tried to repeal Sulla's laws and start a rebellion. The Senate, in a panic, was forced to turn again to the only man who had an army and a reputation as a victor, Gnaeus Pompeius. Pompey, who was only 28, again received extraordinary powers. Once again bypassing all laws, he easily defeated Lepidus, but after the victory he made a bold move. He refused to disband his army. He demanded a new appointment from the Senate. He wanted to be sent to Spain to fight Sertorius, with proconsular authority equal to that of Metellus. The Senate was horrified. To give such a young man who had never held any office the power of a proconsul and command of an army was another monstrous violation of all traditions. But what could they do? Pompey's army stood at the gates of Rome. One senator sarcastically exclaimed that if they were to send him, it should not be as a proconsul, but in place of both consuls. The joke proved prophetic. After long debates, the Senate was forced to yield. In 76 before Christ, Pompey arrived in Spain with a 30,000-strong army. He was full of self-confidence, contemptuously calling Sertorius a runaway slave and his army a band of robbers. He expected a quick and easy victory, but he was in for a rude awakening. The war in Spain turned into a real nightmare for Pompey. It lasted for almost 5 years. Sertorius proved to be a far more formidable opponent than he had expected. In the very first major battle on the Sucro River, Pompey was nearly killed. Sertorius crushed his left flank and Pompey himself was wounded and escaped only by a miracle, leaving his richly harnessed horse in enemy hands. The next day, Metellus arrived, and Sertorius ironically remarked that if that old woman, referring to Metellus, hadn't come, he would have thrashed that boy, Pompey, and sent him back to Rome. Year after year, Pompey and Metellus tried to trap Sertorius, but he always slipped away. Pompey was losing men and his army was starving. He was forced to write angry letters to Rome. demanding money and reinforcements, threatening otherwise to bring his army to Italy, where, he said, there were no fewer problems than in Spain. He was learning to fight in a new way. He realized that brute force was useless here. He began to adopt his enemy's tactics. He built fortresses, cut supply lines, and won over Iberian tribes with diplomacy and generous promises. He understood that this was a war not of annihilation but of attrition. And in the end, Sertorius fell not on the battlefield. He was assassinated as a result of a conspiracy by his own officers, Roman aristocrats who envied his fame and were tired of the endless war. In 72 before Christ, during a banquet, they fell upon him and stabbed him to death. Sertorius's death meant the end of the war. Deprived of their brilliant leader, the rebels were quickly defeated. Pompey dealt harshly with the conspirators who had killed Sertorius, demonstrating that treason is not rewarded. He spent several years in Spain, organizing the new province, founding cities including Pompeiopolis, modern Pamplona. He acted not only as a commander but also as a wise administrator, laying the foundations for a lasting Roman peace in Spain. In 71 before Christ, he returned to Italy. He was returning a victor, having finished one of the longest and most difficult wars in Roman history. But on the threshold of Italy, a new trial and a new chance to win even greater glory awaited him. Italy was engulfed in the flames of the largest slave rebellion Rome had ever seen, and it was led by a Thracian gladiator named Spartacus. While Pompey was bogged down for years in the difficult war in Spain, a catastrophe erupted in Italy itself that shook the foundations of Roman society to its core. In 73 before Christ, a small group of slaves armed with kitchen knives escaped from a gladiatorial school in Capua. Their leader was Spartacus. This minor incident, which no one paid attention to at first, grew into a gigantic rebellion. Tens of thousands of slaves from all over Italy flocked to Spartacus. His army, poorly armed but inspired by a thirst for freedom, terrified the entire country. The Roman Senate, which despised slaves and considered war against them humiliating, sent one army after another against them, but all were defeated. Spartacus's army marched through Italy with fire and sword, defeating several praetors and even both consuls of 72. Rome was in a panic. Finally, in 71 before Christ, command of the war was entrusted to Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus was one of the richest men in Rome, a former associate of Sulla, but his military reputation was not high. He desperately envied Pompey's fame and saw the war with Spartacus as his chance to prove his own worth. Crassus acted methodically and brutally. He restored discipline in the army through decimation, that is, the execution of every 10th soldier in disgraced legions. Eventually, he managed to trap Spartacus's army in the far south of Italy, on the toe of the boot, and cut it off from the rest of the country by digging a huge ditch 55 kilometers long. In the final battle in Apulia, the slave army was utterly defeated. Spartacus himself is said to have died heroically in battle, fighting in the front ranks. Crassus had won a complete victory. 6,000 captured slaves were crucified along the entire Appian Way from Capua to Rome. A terrible spectacle intended to forever deter slaves from rebellion. It was at this moment that Pompey was returning from Spain with his victorious army. And fate presented him with a truly royal gift, a 5,000-strong detachment of slaves which had broken through to the north after the defeat. Accidentally ran into Pompey's legions. Pompey easily destroyed this detachment, and he immediately sent a dispatch to the Senate in which he brazenly claimed all the glory. He wrote that Crassus had defeated the gladiators in open battle, but he, Pompey, had destroyed the very root of the war. Crassus was furious. He had done all the dirty work, risked his life and fortune, and Pompey, by accidentally stumbling upon the remnants of a defeated army, had stolen his victory. This incident marked the beginning of a deep and long-standing enmity between the two most powerful men in Rome. Both commanders, Pompey and Crassus, now stood with their armies at the gates of Rome, and both demanded the highest honors from the Senate. Pompey demanded his second triumph and, what was even more unheard of, the consulship for the next year 70. By law, he had no right to it. He was only 35, while the minimum age for a consul was 42. He had not passed a single step of the so-called career ladder, had been neither quaestor nor praetor. He was not even a senator. Crassus also demanded a triumph and the consulship. The Senate found itself in an impossible position. Two huge armies stood at the city gates, and their commanders clearly had no intention of backing down. To avoid a new civil war, the senators were forced to capitulate. Pompey and Crassus were allowed to run for office, and they were, of course, elected consuls. Pompey celebrated his second triumph, this time for his victory in Spain. Crassus, as the victor over slaves rather than a foreign enemy, was allowed only an ovation, that is, a minor triumph, during which he entered the city on foot and wearing a wreath of myrtle, not laurel. The consulship of Pompey and Crassus in 70 before Christ was a turning point. These two rivals, forced to act together, dealt a crushing blow to the aristocratic constitution that their former patron Sulla had created. They fully restored the rights of the popular tribunes, whom Sulla had practically stripped of power. They carried out judicial reform, expelling senators who were notorious for their corruption from the courts and transferring judicial power to mixed commissions of senators, equestrians, and treasury tribunes. These reforms were extremely popular with the people and the equestrian order, but they were a direct challenge to the senatorial oligarchy. Pompey, whom the Optimates had until then considered their own, a hero of Sulla, had betrayed them. He had made an alliance with the populares to strengthen his own power. From that moment, the Senate began to see him not as a defender but as a dangerous demagogue, a man ready to destroy the foundations of the state for his own ambition. After his consulship ended, Pompey made another unexpected move. He did not take a province to govern as was customary, but retired to private life. For 2 years he held no office, living in Rome as a private citizen, but surrounded by the aura of the greatest general. He was waiting. He was waiting for a new crisis, a new war that would force Rome to turn to him again and give him even more extraordinary, even more unprecedented powers. And that crisis was not long in coming. It seemed that Rome, having survived civil wars and a slave rebellion, could finally breathe easy. But a new, even more insidious threat loomed over it, which came not from legions of rebels, but from the sea. The Mediterranean Sea, which the Romans called Mar Nostrum, was no longer theirs. It had become the kingdom of pirates. This was not just robbery at sea. It was a veritable pirate empire. Its center was Cilicia, a mountainous region on the southern coast of Asia Minor. From their impregnable fortresses, pirates on their light and swift ships controlled all sea lanes. These were not scattered gangs. They had created a real quasi-state. They had their own laws, their own shipyards, their own arsenals. They lived in fortified towns with their families and traded in plundered goods. Their main business besides simple robbery was the slave trade. The island of Delos became a gigantic slave market where, according to contemporaries, up to 10,000 people captured by pirates all over the Mediterranean could be sold in a single day. This was a cancer that paralyzed the economy and threatened the very existence of Rome. They were perfectly organized, had their bases, shipyards, and intelligence network. Their fleet numbered over 1,000 ships. They even created a kind of brotherhood with a cult of the god Mithras. The consequences of their activities were catastrophic for Rome. Trade was completely paralyzed. The delivery of grain from Sicily and Egypt, on which the life of Rome's million-strong population depended, almost ceased. Famine began in the capital, and bread prices skyrocketed. The pirates did not just rob merchant ships. They carried out daring raids on the coast of Italy, plundering villas, capturing noble Romans, among them the young Julius Caesar, who, while in captivity, boldly joked with his captors that he would return and crucify them, which he did after being released, and demanding huge ransoms for them. They went so far as to burn the Roman fleet in Italy's main harbor, Ostia, at the mouth of the Tiber. This was an unheard-of humiliation. Rome sent one commander after another against them, but all their efforts were in vain. The pirates, defeated in one place, immediately appeared in another. It became clear that to solve this problem, not ordinary measures but something extraordinary was needed. And so, in 67 before Christ, the popular tribune Aulus Gabinius, a close friend of Pompey, introduced a bill in the popular assembly that shocked the Senate. The Gabinian law proposed to grant one person, whose name was not mentioned but everyone understood who was meant, unprecedented powers to fight the pirates. This person was to receive supreme authority for 3 years over the entire Mediterranean Sea and 50 miles inland and from the coast. This meant that his authority extended over most of the Roman provinces, and he stood above their governors. He also received the right to recruit up to 120,000 infantrymen and 5,000 horsemen, the right to equip a fleet of up to 500 ships, the right to dispose of the state treasury at his discretion, and the right to appoint 24 legates of senatorial rank. This was practically an unlimited military dictatorship over half the Roman world. The Senate rose up in horror against this law. The Optimates cried that this was the end of the Republic, that they did not want to create a new king. Even Pompey's friends were frightened, but the people, driven to desperation by hunger and high prices, ardently supported the bill. The forum was surrounded by crowds threatening the senators. In the end, despite the desperate resistance of the aristocracy, the Gabinian law was passed, and the command, of course, was given to Gnaeus Pompeius. Pompey, who had been modestly staying outside the city all this time, accepted this immense power with feigned reluctance. But as soon as the law was passed, he began to act with an incredible speed and efficiency that amazed everyone. He did not chase after individual pirate bands. He applied a strategy of total war based on impeccable logistics. He divided the entire Mediterranean Sea into 13 sectors. To each sector, he appointed one of his legates with a squadron. His plan was brilliantly simple. He ordered all his forces to begin an offensive simultaneously, moving from west to east. He, as it were, combed the sea with a giant net. The pirates, driven out of one sector, could not take refuge in a neighboring one, as another Roman fleet was already waiting for them there. In the first 40 days, he completely cleared the western Mediterranean of pirates, namely Sicily, Africa, and Sardinia. Trade was immediately resumed and a flood of cheap grain poured into Rome. His popularity reached the heavens. Then he, with his main forces, moved east into the very lair of the pirates to Cilicia. He defeated their fleet in a decisive battle at Caucasus, but here too he displayed not only military might but also wise policy. Instead of executing or crucifying thousands of surrendered pirates, he offered them amnesty. He understood that many of them had become robbers not out of choice, but because of wars and ruin. He resettled them inland in deserted cities and on fertile lands, turning them from enemies into peaceful farmers and citizens. He even named one such city after himself, Pompeiopolis. The entire campaign, for which he had been allotted 3 years, was completed in 3 months. It was the fastest and most effective military operation in Roman history. Pompey returned to Rome an absolute hero, the savior of the fatherland. He had proved that extraordinary powers in his hands were not a threat, but a blessing for the Republic. He stood at the pinnacle of fame and power, and ahead of him lay a new, even greater war. which was to make him the master of the entire East. While Pompey was clearing the seas of pirates, in the East, Roman legions had been waging a difficult and exhausting war for many years. Their enemy was Rome's old and irreconcilable foe, King Mithridates VI, Eupator of Pontus. This was one of the most outstanding and dangerous enemies the Republic had ever faced. Intelligent, educated, he knew 22 languages, incredibly cruel and indomitable, he had challenged Roman rule for decades. He had survived a war with Sulla and was now waging a new, third Mithridatic war against another talented Roman commander, Lucius Licinius Lucullus. Lucullus was a brilliant strategist and tactician. He had won several brilliant victories over Mithridates and his ally, the Armenian king Tigranes the Great. But he was a strict disciplinarian and was not loved by his soldiers. Moreover, his just administration in the province of Asia, where he protected the local population from the plunder of Roman tax farmers, made him powerful enemies in Rome. In 66 before Christ, while Pompey was still reaping the fruits of his victory over the pirates, his supporters in Rome dealt a new blow to the Senate. The popular tribune Gaius Manilius proposed another extraordinary law. The Manilian law transferred command in the war against Mithridates and Tigranes to Pompey, as well as the governance of the provinces of Cilicia, Bithynia, and Pontus. In effect, to his already immense power over the sea was added unlimited power over the entire Roman East. The Senate was again furious, but its resistance was broken. This time, not only the people but also the equestrian order, who saw Pompey as the protector of their commercial interests, supported the law. The young but already popular orator Marcus Tullius Cicero also spoke in support of the Manilian law, delivering his famous speech in which he argued that only Pompey's genius could end this endless war. The law was passed. Pompey received the most powerful military command ever given to a Roman general. Taking command from Lucullus, their meeting, according to Plutarch, was very cold and full of mutual reproaches. Pompey began to act with his usual energy. He made an alliance with the Parthian king, who attacked Mithridates from the rear. Then he caught the Pontic king's army at the Lycus River and inflicted a crushing defeat in a night battle. Mithridates fled again, this time to his most distant possessions, the Bosporan kingdom in the Crimea. Then Pompey turned against his ally, the Armenian king Tigranes. He invaded Armenia. Tigranes, whose empire was already weakened by Lucullus's campaigns, did not dare to fight. He came to Pompey's camp, took off his royal tiara, and prostrated himself at the Roman general's feet. Pompey treated him mercifully, but humiliatingly. He left him his hereditary kingdom, but took away all his conquests. Armenia became a vassal of Rome. After this, Pompey made a grand campaign through the Caucasus, subjugating the Iberians and Albanians and reaching the shores of the Caspian Sea. Then he returned and definitively turned Pontus and Syria into Roman provinces. He went south to Judea, where he intervened in a dynastic struggle between the brothers Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. He besieged and took Jerusalem, even entering the Holy of Holies of the Jerusalem temple, which was a terrible sacrilege in the eyes of the Jews. He installed Hyrcanus on the throne, making Judea a client state of Rome. While he was establishing order in the east, news came of his main enemy's death. The old Mithridates, even in exile in the Crimea, had not abandoned his plans. He was gathering a new army of Scythian tribes to invade Italy through the Balkans. But his own son, Pharsalus, rebelled against him. Besieged in his palace in Pantikapaeum, the 72-year-old Mithridates committed suicide by taking poison, and when that failed, legend says due to his habit of taking small doses of poison since childhood, by ordering his Gallic bodyguard to kill him with a sword. The war was over. In a few years, Pompey had completely redrawn the map of the Middle East. He founded dozens of cities. He created a whole system of client buffer kingdoms on the border with Parthia. He established a lasting Roman peace and, most importantly, ensured the flow of vast, unprecedented revenues into the Roman treasury. According to Plutarch, the state's revenues increased from 50 to 85 million denarii a year. 20,000 talents of silver and gold were deposited in the treasury, not counting distributions to the soldiers. This was an astronomical sum that forever changed Rome's economy, making it the financial center of the world, but also increasing wealth inequality. His personal booty was fabulous. He became the richest man in Rome after Crassus. In 62 before Christ, after almost 5 years of absence, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, conqueror of the East, landed in Brundisium. All of Italy held its breath in terror. Everyone expected that he, like Sulla, would lead his victorious, devoted army against Rome and establish a dictatorship. But Pompey did something that stunned everyone. As soon as he set foot on Italian soil, he disbanded his legions, ordering the soldiers to go home. He showed everyone that he was not a new Sulla, but a law-abiding citizen of the Republic. He intended to enter Rome not as a tyrant, but as the first citizen, relying on his unassailable authority and fame. It was a noble gesture. But it was also his greatest political mistake. Deprived of his army, he was defenseless against the intrigues of his enemies in the Senate. On September 28, 61 before Christ, on his 45th birthday, Pompey celebrated his third and most magnificent triumph. It lasted for 2 days. Before his chariot were carried tablets with the names of the kingdoms and cities he had conquered. Countless treasures were paraded, namely gold, silver, precious stones. Captive kings and the children of Mithridates were led in the procession. Pompey himself rode in a chariot adorned with jewels, wearing a cloak that, according to tradition, had belonged to Alexander the Great himself. It was the apogee of his glory. He was on top of the world. He was Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, and he did not know that his slow and painful path to sunset had already begun. Returning to Rome as a private citizen, Pompey expected the Senate to welcome him with open arms and unreservedly approve all his arrangements in the East and grant land to his veterans. But he was sorely mistaken. Deprived of his legions, he was no longer a formidable force. And his enemies in the Senate, led by staunch Optimates like Lucius Licinius Lucullus, whom Pompey had humiliated by taking his command, and Marcus Porcius Cato the Younger, a stoic and unyielding defender of the old order, decided to put the upstart in his place. They began to systematically sabotage all his initiatives. They nitpicked every detail, demanded that each of his arrangements in the East be considered separately, and delayed the decision on land for the veterans. For Pompey, accustomed to commanding kings, this was an unbearable humiliation. The greatest general of Rome found himself powerless in the labyrinth of senatorial intrigues. He was a bull in a china shop. It was at this moment of political humiliation and impotence that 2 other men, whose ambitions were no less than Pompey's, entered the stage. The first was his old enemy, Marcus Licinius Crassus. He was still the richest man in Rome and had enormous influence among the equestrians and financiers, but he lacked the military glory that Pompey possessed. The second was Gaius Julius Caesar. At that time he was still a rising star, but already one of the brightest politicians in Rome. Descended from the most ancient patrician family, he was, nevertheless, the leader of the populares. He was a brilliant orator, a charming man, and a genius political intriguer. He had just returned from Spain, where he had successfully governed a province and won several military victories. Now he wanted to obtain the consulship. Caesar saw a unique opportunity. He realized that Pompey, Crassus, and he himself, while powerless individually against the senatorial oligarchy, could together become an irresistible force. He acted as a mediator between the 2 sworn enemies, Pompey and Crassus. He convinced them that their mutual enmity only played into the hands of their common enemies, the Optimates. He proposed that they form a secret alliance. In 60 before Christ, this alliance was formed. It went down in history as the first Triumvirate. It was not an official state institution, but a private agreement between the three most powerful men in Rome. Its essence was simple. They agreed that nothing in the state would happen without their joint consent. They combined Pompey's military authority, Crassus's money, and Caesar's political genius and popularity. It was, in effect, a conspiracy to seize power. The first fruit of this alliance was Caesar's election as consul for 59 before Christ. Having obtained the highest power, Caesar immediately fulfilled his obligations to his allies. Acting assertively and often against the law, intimidating his consular colleague Bibulus so much that he did not leave his house for the rest of the year, Caesar passed all the necessary laws. Pompey's arrangements in the east were approved in a single package. His veterans received land. The interests of Crassus's tax farmers were also satisfied. To seal this alliance, Caesar also used dynastic ties. He married his only daughter, the young and beautiful Julia, to Pompey. Pompey was already in his late 40s, but according to Plutarch, he was genuinely in love with his young wife. This marriage, initially purely political, turned into a union based on deep affection. At the end of his consulship, Caesar secured for himself a 5-year proconsulship in Gaul. This was a brilliant move. He was leaving Rome to acquire what he lacked compared to Pompey, a great army and great military glory, and Pompey remained in Rome. He was, it seemed, at the pinnacle. He had achieved everything he wanted. He was the informal head of state, married to his ally's daughter. He even built the first permanent stone theater in Rome, a grandiose structure at the foot of which he erected a temple to Venus Victrix and his own statue. But his position was deceptive. Remaining in Rome without legions, he gradually began to lose his influence. The political struggle in the streets of Rome became increasingly fierce. The city was terrorized by gangs maintained by various politicians. The most notorious was the gang of the Populares leader Publius Clodius Pulcher, who became Pompey's bitterest enemy, publicly humiliating and attacking him in the Forum. It reached the point where Pompey, the conqueror of kings, was effectively besieged in his own house. Clodius's gangs threw stones at his house, ambushed him in the streets, and shouted insults. The great general, who had known no defeats on the battlefield, was completely helpless in sordid street brawls. This was a profound humiliation that undermined his authority and showed the precariousness of his position. He was a giant on the world stage, but a dwarf in the Roman Forum. Meanwhile, increasingly loud news of Caesar's incredible victories was coming from Gaul. He was conquering tribe after tribe, had reached Britain and the Rhine. His fame was beginning to eclipse that of Pompey himself. The fragile balance in the triumvirate began to be disturbed. Pompey watched with growing anxiety and jealousy the dizzying rise of his young ally and son-in-law. By the mid-50s of the 1st century before Christ, the first triumvirate was creaking at the seams. The alliance that had worked so effectively at the beginning was being undermined by mutual jealousy and a shifting balance of power. In 56 before Christ, the triumvirs met in the city of Lucca to reaffirm their alliance and agree on the future. It was decided that Pompey and Crassus would become consuls for the next year, and after their consulship they would receive provinces to govern. Pompey, Spain, and Crassus, Syria, where he dreamed of starting a war with Parthia and winning military glory equal to that of Pompey and Caesar. Caesar's proconsulship in Gaul was also extended for another 5 years, but the events that followed this meeting destroyed the fragile alliance completely. First came a personal tragedy. In 54 before Christ, Julia, Pompey's wife and Caesar's daughter, died in childbirth. Her death severed the last personal thread connecting the two giants. Soon after, The newborn child also died, and in the following year, 53 before Christ, terrible news came from Syria. Crassus, having embarked on his campaign against the Parthians, suffered one of the most crushing defeats in Roman history. At the Battle of Carrhae, his army was surrounded and annihilated by Parthian cavalry. Crassus himself was treacherously killed during negotiations. According to legend, the Parthians, knowing his greed, poured molten gold down his throat. His death meant the end of the Triumvirate. Now there were only two of them, Pompey and Caesar, two suns in one sky. Their clash was only a matter of time. In Rome, meanwhile, anarchy was growing. Street fights between the gangs of Clodius and his rival Milo paralyzed the city's life. In 52 before Christ, Clodius was killed and his supporters in a rage burned down the Senate house. In this situation of complete chaos, the entire senatorial aristocracy, even Pompey's old enemies, saw him as the only savior. This was a paradoxical turn. The Optimates, who for years had fought Pompey, humiliated him and blocked his laws, now came to him cap in hand. They realized that Caesar, with his hardened army and boundless popularity, posed a much greater threat to their power and privileges. Pompey, for all his ambition, was still a man who had disbanded his army and tried to act within the framework of tradition. He seemed to them the lesser of two evils. They decided to use him as a battering ram against Caesar, and then, as they hoped, to get rid of him as well. The Senate made an unprecedented decision. Pompey was elected consul without a colleague, that is, effectively the sole ruler, a dictator within the law. Having received this power, Pompey quickly restored order in Rome. He passed laws against violence and bribery in elections, and tried and exiled the leaders of armed gangs. He seemed to have become what he had always wanted to be, the first citizen, the savior of the Republic, and it was at this moment that he made his final choice. He broke with Caesar and made an alliance with his former enemies, the Optimates. He married Cornelia Metella, the daughter of one of Caesar's most ardent enemies, Quintus Metellus Scipio. A complex legal and political struggle began. Caesar's proconsulship in Gaul was coming to an end. He wanted by law to run for the consulship in absentia while in his province and to arrive in Rome already as consul-elect. This would give him immunity. His enemies in the Senate, pushed by Pompey, demanded that he first disband his army, return to Rome as a private citizen, and only then run for office. For Caesar, this was tantamount to suicide. Returning to Rome without an army, he would be immediately put on trial by his enemies for all his illegal actions during his first consulship. Pompey took an ambiguous position. He said he respected the law, but at the same time did everything to deprive Caesar of his army. He even took 2 legions from him under the pretext of needing them for the Parthian War, but kept them in Italy. The tension was building. Caesar proposed compromises. He agreed to disband most of his army if Pompey did the same. But the Senate, feeling Pompey's support behind it, took an increasingly hard line. In early January of 49 before Christ, Caesar made his final offer. He was willing to disband all his legions except one and to give up Gaul if he were allowed to retain Illyricum until his election as consul. But his offer was rejected. The Senate, incited by his most ardent enemies like Cato and Consul Marcellus, passed an emergency decree, effectively declaring Caesar an enemy of the state and giving Pompey full power to defend the Republic. The popular tribunes who tried to veto this decision were expelled from the Senate and fled to Caesar's camp. For Caesar, this was the last straw. He was left with no choice. Either he submits, disbands his army, and surrenders himself to his enemies, or he starts a civil war. On the night of January 10th to 11th, 49 before Christ, Gaius Julius Caesar, with his single legion, the 13th Twin Legion, reached the small river that served as the border between his province and Italy. The river was called the Rubicon. To cross this river with an army was an act of high treason. According to tradition, he hesitated for a long time, but then he uttered his famous phrase about the die being cast, and he gave the order to advance. The civil war had begun. Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon caught Pompey and the Senate off guard. They had not expected such audacity and speed from him. Panic erupted in Rome. Pompey, who had confidently declared that he only needed to stamp his foot for legions to spring from the earth, found that he had no combat-ready army in Italy. The legions he had raised were unreliable. Caesar's veterans, hardened in 10 years of the Gallic War, were incomparably stronger. And Pompey made a difficult but probably the only correct decision from a military point of view. He decided to abandon Italy and Rome without a fight. He declared that any senator who remained in Rome would be considered a traitor. Together with the consuls and most of the Senate, he fled south to Brundisium, from where he planned to cross to Greece. This great escape was perceived by many as a disgrace and a sign of weakness. Caesar moved rapidly south, capturing one city after another with virtually no resistance. He tried to trap Pompey in Brundisium, but Pompey, displaying great tactical skill, managed to ferry his entire army and fleet across the Adriatic Sea to Greece. Caesar, having no fleet, could not pursue him. He became master of Italy. But the war was far from over. Pompey was master of the entire East. He had at his disposal vast resources, a powerful fleet that controlled the entire sea, and numerous battle-hardened legions stationed in the provinces. His plan was simple: to blockade Italy by sea, cause famine there, gather a huge army in the Balkans, and then, when the time was right, land in Italy and crush Caesar. The plan was good, but it did not account for one thing: the genius and speed of his opponent. Caesar, instead of waiting, struck first. He first made a lightning campaign to Spain, where he defeated a huge Pompeian army. Then, in the winter of 49 to 48 before Christ, he performed an almost insane act. Despite winter storms and the dominance of Pompey's fleet at sea, he managed to ferry part of his army across the Adriatic and land in Epirus. A long and grueling campaign began. 2 Roman armies stood against each other. Pompey, having numerical superiority and reliable supply by sea, adopted a waiting tactic, seeking to wear down Caesar's army by starvation. Caesar, trapped, made a daring attempt to blockade Pompey's huge camp near the city of Dyrrhachium by building a giant system of fortifications around it, and here Pompey won his last victory. He managed to break the blockade by attacking the weakest section of Caesar's fortifications. Caesar's army was defeated and fled in panic. Caesar himself was almost killed. It was a most severe defeat. If Pompey had ordered the pursuit of the fleeing enemy that day, the war might have been over, but he, fearing a trap, halted his troops. Caesar would later say that the enemy would have won today if they had someone who knew how to win. After the defeat at Dyrrhachium, Caesar was forced to retreat inland to Thessaly. Pompey followed him, and here he began to be pressured by the noble senators in his camp. Elated by the victory at Dyrrhachium, they demanded a decisive battle. Their camp, according to Caesar himself, resembled a holiday resort more than a military headquarters. The senators lived in tents entwined with ivy, drank from silver cups, and were already dividing up magistracies in Rome for the next year. They were arguing over who would become Pontifex Maximus after Caesar, who would get his villas. They were tired of the war. They wanted to return to Rome as soon as possible and divide the offices and property of the vanquished. They mocked Pompey's caution, calling him Agamemnon, king of kings, unwilling to part with power. Pompey, against his better judgment, yielded to this pressure. He decided to give a general battle. On August 9th, 48 before Christ, the 2 armies met on the plain near the city of Pharsalus. Pompey had a huge advantage. His army numbered about 45,000 infantry and 7,000 horsemen. Caesar had only 22,000 infantry and about 1,000 horsemen. Pompey's plan was simple: He intended for his powerful cavalry, concentrated on the left flank, to crush Caesar's small cavalry, get behind him, and start a slaughter. But Caesar saw through his plan. He made a brilliant tactical move. Behind his right flank, he secretly placed a reserve detachment of 6 elite cohorts, about 3,000 men, ordering them not to throw their pilae, but to use them as spears, aiming for the faces and eyes of Pompey's noble horsemen. The battle began. Pompey's cavalry, as planned, attacked and routed Caesar's cavalry. Confident of victory, they rushed forward, and then from ambush, Caesar's reserve 4th line struck them. The effect was stunning. The Pompeian horsemen, mostly young aristocrats, not expecting such resistance and fearing for their faces, panicked and turned back, crushing the ranks of their own infantry. At that moment, Caesar threw his main forces into the attack. Pompey's army wavered and fled. Pompey himself, seeing the rout of his cavalry, seemed to lose the will to fight. He silently retired to his lavishly decorated camp, sat in his tent, and waited for the end. When Caesar's legions stormed the camp, he tore off his insignia, changed into simple clothes, mounted a horse, and fled. The Battle of Pharsalus was lost. The Republic was lost. Pompey's flight after Pharsalus was pathetic. He wandered among the islands of the Aegean Sea, trying to gather the remnants of his supporters. In the end, he decided to seek refuge in Egypt. This was his last and fatal miscalculation. His death on the Egyptian shore was not just a murder. It was a symbol of the end of an era. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria and was presented with the head and ring of his vanquished enemy as a gift, he, according to tradition, turned away and wept. Whether he wept for Pompey, his former son-in-law and ally, or for the republic that they had both destroyed, we will never know. What is the legacy of Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus? His fate is one of the greatest tragedies in history. He was a man who possessed all the gifts of fortune, namely beauty, wealth, and incredible military luck. He was a brilliant commander, perhaps one of the best in Roman history. His victory over the pirates was a masterpiece of strategy and logistics. His conquest of the East forever changed the map of the world. He was also a talented administrator, able not only to conquer, but also to organize what was conquered. But he lacked the main thing, the political genius and ruthlessness that his rival possessed in full measure. Pompey was a man of a transitional era, stuck between two worlds. He spent his whole life violating the laws of the Republic, demanding extraordinary powers for himself, but at the same time sincerely wanted to remain its first citizen, its defender. He wanted to be the great, but within the framework of the old system. Caesar understood that this system was dead, and that to rule Rome one had to stand above it. Pompey was a man who always hesitated at the decisive moment. He did not dare to pursue Caesar after Dyrrhachium. He yielded to the pressure of the senators at Pharsalus. His tragedy is the tragedy of a man who won all the battles except the last and most important one. Historians evaluate him differently. For some, like Cicero, he was the last hope of the Republic, albeit an imperfect one. For others, just a less successful tyrant than Caesar. But all agree on one thing: he was one of the most brilliant and significant figures in Roman history. His life, full of incredible rises and falls, became an eternal lesson on how fame and power can turn to dust, and how in great turning point eras, the fate of the entire world can depend on the clash of wills of two titans. He did not become the founder of the empire, but it was he, together with Caesar, who cleared the way for it by destroying the old republic that they had both so desperately tried to command. His shadow, the shadow of the great, remained forever on the threshold of the new era that he was not destined to see. Thank you for your attention. If this story seemed interesting to you, and you wish to continue immersing yourselves in the most exciting and dramatic pages of the past, please subscribe to our channel, leave your comments, and share this video. Many more amazing journeys through time await us.